Good morning. My name is Troy Hopkins, and I'm the principal of Ashford School and also a member of the CAS Education Equity Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our breakout session, Solving the Complex and Overlapping Problems of Inequity, Trauma, Social Emotional Deficits, and Learning Losses Through the Eyes of Third Bucket Kids. This topic is critically important as we dive more deeply and explore how we can work together to learn and lead for systemic racial and social justice. Thank you so much for attending this session and joining us today. I want to begin by recognizing and thanking our education partners, the Connecticut Department of Education and SERC, for their generous support in helping us make this Education Equity Summit possible. And now, just a couple of quick reminders. Everyone has been muted. If possible, please turn your video on, as it is nice to see everyone. Please ask questions in the chat or raise your hand with the button at the bottom of the screen to be recognized by the presenters if you'd like to speak. We'll do our best to answer your questions during this webinar. Along with asking questions in the chat, please use the chat to share ideas and let us know if you are experiencing technical problems during the Zoom meeting, and we will be monitoring the chat. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CAS website. You will receive a notification as soon as all the sessions from today are available. Please feel free to view the session and the rest of the summit sessions at your leisure and share them with your colleagues and friends. Our hope is that you will find them useful for professional learning within your school community during the coming school year. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters for this session. Dr. Joanne Freiberg holds a PhD in philosophy of education from Ohio State University, and her areas of academic teaching and research include moral and character education, educational studies, professional ethics, and multicultural education. She currently serves as co-chair of the National School Climate Council and is on the Connecticut statewide task force on sportsmanship. She has served on the statewide task force on bullying and serves as an educational consultant in a variety of settings, both in Connecticut and nationally. Joanne provides a wide range of professional development and educational content to many groups and organizations throughout the country about issues including those above, as well as general violence prevention, professional ethics, and related subjects to the school, family, and community partnership arena. Patricia Ciccone, a retired superintendent in Connecticut school districts, is an experienced educator and administrator. She is also the founding partner of School Climate Consultants, LLC, which is dedicated to assisting schools, districts, and community-based organizations in creating safe and productive learning environments. Named by Education Week in their inaugural February 2013 edition as a leader to learn from for school climate improvement. She retired as superintendent of schools for the Connecticut Technical High School System. More recently, she was named by Education Week as one of the 18 women educators internationally that all K-12 educators should know. She currently serves on the Connecticut Legislature's School Climate Advisory Committee and is a member of the leadership team of the National School Climate Council, is on the faculty of the Leadership Academy for Character Education at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, is a certified trainer with the International Institute for Restorative Practices, and is a faculty member at the National School Climate Center's Summer Institute. She also serves as both adjunct faculty and university supervisor at Sacred Heart University, working with aspiring teachers and administrators, and holds Connecticut State Licensed Professional Counselor credentials. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joanne Freiberg and Pat Ciccone.
Thank you, everybody. We're very glad to be with you today. And this has been a very exciting conference so far, and we've listened to all of it. See so many friends, just I guess it says we're really old, but the point is nice to see everybody. And Pat and I are going to tag team this, and she'll jump in at any point, but I'm controlling the screen. So that's, she'll have to muzzle or nuzzle in when appropriate. But what we wanted to talk with you about today is something that has come to our attention within the last year. And this is the notion of third bucket kids. We'll talk about that. But why don't we just get into it? Well, let me say that third bucket kids, just so we don't confuse anybody, this term has come up during the pandemic. First bucket kids are kids who have been in person with us as much as possible. Second bucket kids are kids who have been with us virtually. And third bucket kids are the ones that are MIA. They're missing in action. We used to call them chronically absent, but this is a global problem. And it may be a little bit different here than it is in countries in Africa or in Asia and so on. But this is a global problem, and it's being tackled as a global problem. For example, just in some African countries, if girls, young adolescent girls are not in school during the pandemic, they may have gotten married off, for example. So this is, every country has its own context, but we're using that lens to talk about these issues. And we thought we'd begin by introducing the notion of institutional betrayal. And as I always like to say, I am not smart enough to make anything up. So we like to pull from a great deal of resources, and we're well aware that this is a conference on equity. And as you will see, this dovetails very well with what has already been said, and I think is additive to the conversation that is going on today. But institutional betrayal, coming from Carly Smith and Jennifer Freid, says that institutions like schools, churches, health and human services, and the military may inflict harm on people who depend on them for safety and well-being. And so trying to think about that notion of, are we betraying kids or are we serving them appropriately, is what we wanted to begin with. And this is the flyer of the Third Bucket Kids global effort that is being spearheaded by the Institute for 21st Century Questions. And the sort of the leader of this happens to be Canadian. But just so you are well aware that this is not just a problem here in the United States, but third bucket kids are the ones we are betraying. And we kind of want to put that out there. We like to be a little edgy. Although schooling in America is compulsory, for a variety of reasons, they exist. And they have existed before the pandemic. And now this has come into laser focus. They definitely exist now. Oh, one thing in terms of just the way we like to conduct stuff is throw something in the chat if you wish for questions, that kind of thing. But if you have a question that you'd like to ask, we're totally fine with your just opening your mic and asking that question or raising your hand. Troy's here to help monitor that. We do have a placeholder for questions and comments at the end. But as you're thinking of things, we all benefit if you jump into this conversation.
So Joanne, let me jump in just quickly for the benefit of those who are working in schools and working with schools right now. Remember that we're identifying third bucket kids. And we're saying that education is compulsory, but for a variety of reasons, these kids have somewhat gone missing, but they're not necessarily missing from our minds. These are the kids that we think about on a regular basis when we're working in schools. Sometimes we are left to just wonder what has happened to them. We do reach out. We know that this is not an intentional betrayal, but we reach out as best we can, as much as time will allow, and try to connect with kids who are considered third bucket kids. But these are kids who are known to us, but not with us.
Thank you, Pat. And that's very helpful to frame all this. So why are there third bucket kids? And again, we can talk about chronically absent kids, and we have for a very long time used that phrase, but this all applies no matter what we label them. For some kids and parents and guardians, they don't see any value in school. And all morning we've been talking about connecting with individuals' contexts and histories. So that may be a reason. Then of course there's school refusal. for all kinds of reasons. And there's previous failure. And that's not only academic failure, but behavioral failure. We've labeled this the school to prison pipeline. And another reason, maybe there's lack of support to foster mental health and heal trauma. Now, we have a really important distinction here. We want every child, every educator, every parent to be mentally healthy. But trauma is injury. And so we have to heal trauma in a context of having everybody be mentally healthy. And that is a really important distinction. There may be lack of access to educational programs, and we certainly saw that technologically during the pandemic. And then, of course, we heard all morning, lack of connection to the curricula. It just doesn't connect with us for one reason or another. Then there's another reason, there's trauma, there's toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences, all different titles for the same thing. And then, of course, inequities. So there are all kinds of reasons, and this list is not meant to be exhaustive. So first and foremost, we need to find them. And some districts are much more rigorous in their tracking these kids down through personal connections, whether that's telephone, email, social media, knocking on doors. But we have to go where parents and guardians are comfortable. So school may not be it, but homes, places of worship, community locations, all of those places we need to go to find these young people and bring them back into the fold. But we also need to explore root causes with parents and guardians and students and meet needs versus threatening. Now, as we've gone through this before, people say, well, what do you mean by threatening? Well, wagging your finger in somebody's face and saying, you have missed school for a year and a half. You are so far behind. You have to catch up and you have to be there. Now, I say that for emphasis, but whether it's a veiled threat or an explicit threat, it's how we are dealing with them and bringing them back in. And once we have found them, we have to keep them engaged and attending. And Pat, I know you'll jump in at any point. So we put this little graphic together and we hope that it's helpful because we believe, and this is not to frighten anybody, but it absolutely is to make sure we all understand what the stakes are. I mean, today, the conference is focused on equity or inequity. And we believe that we are headed for a potential explosion or collision because we have inequities, there's trauma, there's also learning losses and social, emotional, and behavioral deficits. And throughout the pandemic, I mean, we are fortunate that we have colleagues at all kinds of state levels, as well as on the ground in many, many districts. And throughout the pandemic, the mantra, the thing that rose to the top was SEL, social emotional learning. Now, we like to reframe that and talk about achieving social emotional growth because
I'm like being recorded.
There are so many of us here today, not to mention throughout Connecticut. If you asked 10 different people, what does social emotional learning mean? You'd get 10 different definitions. So we need to take kids where they are and talk about social emotional growth. Again, we are very keyed into language. Okay, so we have these converging sort of 5-lane highways. And if we don't manage this appropriately, very carefully, we could be headed for an explosion, a collision. We think we have a way out so we can successfully merge all these lanes and get to the other side. And that's what we are planning to share with you today. So the inequities, and this is not an exhaustive list, but when we think about inequity, we think about racial, religious, ethnic, gender, and sexual orientation, access to technology, economic inequities, opportunistic equities, trauma, adverse childhood experiences. Certainly the pandemic, COVID, continues to be traumatizing. Isolation for many people, anxiety, depression, fear. So this is all kinds of trauma. What about learning losses? Well, it's not just academic, but developmental stages, socialization, life skills, motor skills, collaboration, problem solving. And let me just pause to say that throughout the pandemic, as we mentioned, it was SEL, SEL, SEL. Now, as vaccinations started to get into arms and we thought we're there, we're getting there, everybody's going to be back face to face, this is going to be much more of a normal year, we started hearing from educational leaders, we got to deal with the learning losses. We have to deal with the learning losses. And we worry desperately that mitigating learning losses is going to eclipse all of the other converging pathways. And that's what we're trying to share with everybody today. And then we have the social, emotional, and behavioral deficits, decision-making, relationship skills. Pat always mentions, maybe you want to talk about those little first graders coming in who haven't talked, you take it.
Well, we might actually be facing levels of first grade, second grade, certainly kindergarten, with generation of children who've not learned how to sit in a circle. And if we think over the day-to-day of schooling and just how much we deliver, particularly in those early grades, in the process of sitting in circles, how we share, how we learn, and skill develop in that medium, if you will. These are children who've not had that opportunity. They've been home. And in the case of third bucket kids, we know that they have most likely been isolated even from other children.
So we have all kinds of deficits of this sort: social awareness, self-awareness, executive functioning skills, all of those things that help kids be successful in school. So this is the nexus, and we hope we can get on the other side. So we're going to show this to you at the end with what we think is the pathway toward a healthy aftermath of the pandemic. So Dr. Williams talked about the elephant in the room. We didn't know he was going to share an elephant. This one is not in a political cartoon setting, but we all know, and we have to face this, that institutional racism and institutional betrayal are alive and well, even in this state. And this is a great quote from a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, we recommend it highly, called Caste. The enemy, the threat is not one man, it's all of us lurking in humanity itself. So Chris Murphy, one of our senators, recently, I think it was May, that was published in the Hartford Courant, an op-ed piece. And he talked about institutional betrayal without using that label. And let me just share with you some of the statistics from throughout the country. Every year in the United States, tens of thousands of students are subjected to harsh, exclusionary disciplinary tactics. And this is disproportionately used with Black, Latino, LGBTQ, et cetera, low income circumstances, or children with disabilities. And we're not sharing anything that you don't know, but we have to bring this out in the open and recognize it. Black students are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested at school than their white peers, and students of color are treated differently when engaging in the same exact behaviors as white students. This is highly inequitable. And again, we have to figure out how do we eliminate the inequities, and that's where we're going. Every year, 50,000 preschoolers are suspended from their classrooms. Now, this data was fueling the passage of the law that happened, 3-4 years ago, where in Connecticut, it is not legal to suspend a child 7 or younger. Does it still happen? You better believe it, but at least we're recognizing it's a problem. And nationally, 2 million students go to school with police officers, but no counselors. Now, Dr. Cardona mentioned this morning that the number of school counselors is not up to what it needs to be for what the recommendation is, counselor per child. And in 1718, 100,000 students were subjected to restraint and seclusion, and this disproportionately affected students with disabilities. In 19 states, kind of frightening. In 19 states, corporal punishment is still legal. We're not one of them, but that's scary. So we like to use a very helpful perspective from a physician that works with addicts and those who have been traumatized in the Vancouver, Canada area. He says, it's not bad behavior, it's behavior asking for help. In other words, we see how young people act out because they are in gross need. And we see that behavior, but I don't think we're always viewing that behavior appropriately. So here's a US Department of Education statistic. Again, pretty sobering. If a sixth grader is out of school for 10 or more days during a school year, and this is not because of a bad case of chicken pox or out because of COVID, but because of chronic absence or at our hands through school removal, that student has only a 33% likelihood of graduating from high school. So if we keep throwing them out, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I don't mean that pun to, no pun intended, but it's just, why are we doing this? Now, here's some numbers about Connecticut. Latino students are 6 times more likely to get arrested if they go to school with a police officer. And there's an awful lot of discussion. Both Pat and I sit at the statewide SEL task force about what do we do with school resource officers? Do we eliminate them or do we train them? I mean, this is an ongoing conversation. 65% of all student arrests are Black or Latino students, and there's an average of 326 students per school counselor. Again,
Sorry, Joanne, I'm just jumping in. That particular statistic, we heard something very different and higher on average from the Secretary of Education this morning, somewhere in the 450 plus range. In Connecticut, 326 students per school counselor, and the ideal in the trainings that school counselors go through is somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 students. 250 students would be a caseload that they could manage.
Okay, thank you for that, Pat. It's very helpful. In Hartford, a student diagnosed with an emotional disturbance was expelled twice and suspended more than 24 times, then moved to an alternative setting with limited instruction and support. Now, I know that's one case, but I think we could look throughout our state and find many others. Now, this is something that when we do workshops on becoming culturally competent educators, we want to highlight, because this is institutional racism alive and well in our state. And people say, oh, this can't really be true, but it is true. In 1998, the State Department of Education launched its disciplinary database, which has the wonderful label of the ED 166. I think there should be a naming contest, but that aside, it's always called the ED 166. And they started to look at what, why we were suspending kids in the state. And although technically everything up here is a policy violation, that's not how the pie gets sorted out. Policy violations are what we call non-dangerous behaviors. And you can take a peek at what we're talking about here in terms of skipping class tardy, not prepared, out of dress code, didn't serve a required detention, sleeping in class, other kinds of minor infractions. And although we've gotten a little bit better, this is where we are now in 2021, we have only decreased the number of these kinds of suspensions by 9%. So this is a real problem. We call it low-hanging fruit. Why are we suspending kids for non-dangerous behaviors? Now here's another kind of chilling example. This is from Florida, where a 6-year-old was arrested for having a tantrum, which was brought on by her sleep apnea, and kicked a school staffer who was grabbing her wrists in an effort to calm her down. I don't know what calming down means, but it's not that. She was put in handcuffs and put in the back of a police car. And this was one of 2 6-year-olds arrested in the same day at the same school. So what's wrong with this picture? And we're just talking sort of globally. All right, so when we punish misbehavior, and we are equating punishment with exclusionary discipline, and unfortunately, no blame here, but most educators come to the classroom with one disciplinary tool in their toolbox, and that's the hammer. That's exclusionary discipline. And when we use that, it just increases children's stress. It diminishes adult to child relationships. It does nothing to teach more productive skills. It labels the very children who need caring relationships and a safe environment. It normalizes and confirms a life of lose-lose. Why should I be here? They don't want me here. They kick me out. It confirms that adults don't care about them. It does not get to the root of the problem. And it just perpetuates this cycle of hopelessness and increases the number of third bucket kids. Pat, you want to jump in at all here? Just want to.
I'm okay. Yeah.
Okay, I just go like a runaway train, so I don't want to. All right, so what we do know about saving at-risk children is that the single most important factor in helping children who are at risk in any way, and we're talking about any way, academic, social, relational, behavioral, health-wise, is the presence in their life of at least one caring adult. And for kids who are neglected in their home, abused by parents and other family members, community members, they're not looking to family members to be that human being. It's a teacher, it's a mentor, it's a coach, it's a community worker, it's someone like us. And then another piece that feeds right into this is that the single most important factor determining success, and this is not grades, it's about somebody saying, I can do this, I'm sticking with it, I'm going to keep trying, is the student's perception that their teacher likes them. And how often does a child get sent down to a counselor or an assistant principal and asked the infamous question, why did you do that? And the answer is, the teacher hates me. Now, when you're working restoratively, which we're going to talk a little bit about, you never ask why. But the point is, when students and family members, parents and guardians believe that their teachers don't like their children, forget anything else happening. Forget it.
So there is recent research associated with the adolescent world that continues to press the point that adolescents, so at that secondary level, middle school, high school, young people will seek out a person, an adult, anyone apart from their family to share an excitement, a success, to be excited about something, to be proud of something, as well as to be sharing a fear, a concern, why something has made them angry. And that adult, again, is not the family member. So those of us who may have spent time working with adolescents or in the adolescent arena can recognize that very quickly when we're in that arena for a long period of time. We know what it means when a secondary level or adolescent youth want to catch our eye, want to throw out our name and try to connect.
So we all know of the school to prison pipeline. And what we're talking about is the difference between schools and courts is that schools just start alienating offenders at an earlier age through office referrals, detention, privilege denial, suspensions, both in and out of school, and of course, expulsions. We start with that preschooler who's destroying the classroom. And it just goes on from there. This is the school to prison pipeline with the added background of disproportionality. So let's look at some solutions. And one of the things that we like to mention, and we borrow from one of the wonderful assistant superintendents in Stanford, Olympia Della Flora, who likes to say, Superman's not coming. And what she means by that, at least in the short term, schools will not have a near enough social workers, counselors, psychologists to help each and every third bucket child that needs the one-on-one help. We just can't do that full time with every child, and we have to recognize that. So it's not to say that the ESSER funds, the rescue funds aren't significantly impacting that, but we also have to focus on the low-hanging fruit that's going to reap the greatest benefits. The things that we can control and focus attention on are the regular school classrooms. Because even if children do have some one-on-one time with a social worker or counselor and so on, they're going to go back to the classroom. And that's where these children spend most of their time, and that's where we have to focus our attention. So we like to talk about a theory of action, and somebody right in the panel before we came on talked about the importance of relationships. And we believe that the theory of action that's going to get us on the other side so that we don't collide, but that we have successful schools, diminish the amount of third bucket kids, see learning gains and all that kind of stuff, is to focus on relationship building. Because in any school or an organization or a business and so on, the highest achievement is realized where the leaders, and whether these are teachers, administrators, managers, principals, superintendents, focus on relationship building and community building as a top priority to realize any identified goals. So this has to be the theory of action to mitigate those learning losses. We can no longer lead with increased instructional time, because that's you need to do this because you're so far behind. That's not going to get us there. That's just going to alienate. Now, one of the things that has happened in this pandemic, and we thought we'd throw this in because people got it so wrong, we actually found a sign that got it right, is we have to be physically distanced, yet highly socially connected. It's the social connections that matter. So we got to change our language and talk about physical distance. And just to mention the research around school connectedness, because kids who are highly connected to school, parents, guardians who are highly connected to school, staff members, faculty, staff, custodians, and so on that are highly connected to school do better. And these 5 measures of school connectedness were uncovered as the military was looking about 20, 25 years ago at the impact of social mobility, which is really very negative. So here they are, feeling close to people at school. Every student should have friends, peers, and so on, as well as this is a non-negotiable. Every child should have at least one caring adult in school that they feel they can go to. School should be a destination. It should be a happy place. We should look forward to going there and have a sense of belonging, as well as being treated fairly. And when you start to peel back the layers of what does it mean to be fair, it's about equity, not equality, doling out the same thing, and making sure everybody has a voice. And then, of course, feeling safe in all ways at school. So here is what we see as the key to getting on the other side of this potential explosion, so that we can see equity, healing, learning gains, and social emotional growth, is to work restoratively. Now, that's a very unfortunate label, but Chris Murphy, in his op-ed piece, said our #1 priority should be making students feel safe and supported, and how schools reduce conflict and build cultures of trust and respect is essential to this work. And this aligns with Standard 4 of the National School Climate Standards. I've wished for decades that we didn't have a bullying law or an anti-bullying law, but we implemented this because this is the spirit of what the legislature has been trying to do for years. The school community creates an environment where all members, not just some, but all members are welcome, supported, and feel safe in school, socially, emotionally, culturally, racially, intellectually, and physically. So another way to phrase this is we have to achieve Maslow before Bloom. And all of those social emotional deficits, the trauma, the inequities, we have to focus on that if we ever want to reach children so they can learn. And the first priority in the classroom or the home, even over learning, should be the teacher or caregiver student relationship. Relationships lead to emotional security, which then lead to academic achievement. And this correlation is not as indirect as might be believed. As you can see from, this is a high school in Washington. And we have so much data from Connecticut that folks have shared with us that mirror this. But this is a typical high school that in the first bar to the left in 2009, 2010, they were leading with instruction. That was their theory of action. And then they said, nope, we're going to lead with relationships. And especially in a high school, folks were struggling with, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And you can see in every academic area except algebra, academics went down a little bit. But as soon as they figured that out, look what happened. All of the academics soared. So safe schools means having successful students, and we just put down some descriptors: happy, calm, love school, connected, attending, and so on. And safe schools mean they'll be collaborative adults. We often sort of don't talk and focus explicitly on the adults in a school building, but we've heard, I think it's almost every district has had educators during the pandemic drive into the parking lot, park their cars, and just dissolve into tears, and had to have somebody come and help them into the building. This has affected everybody. So we have a moral and practical imperative to focus on how we operate. Because when our little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not to join in their chaos. So what we have to do is make sure that every single environment is safe. Physically, emotionally, culturally, and racially, intellectually, has to be predictable and consistent. You know, nothing is predictable anymore. So let's have school, classrooms be predictable and consistent. No surprises, very clear, expected routines and rituals and so on. So very briefly, and we do 10, 15 hours worth of restorative practice training. So this is just a thumbnail sketch, but just to get us on the other side where folks can ask questions and make comments and so on. As I mentioned in passing, we think restorative practices is a very unfortunate label. It's confusing at best, but it is unfortunate at worst, because there are really two ways of considering what restorative practices are. The first is a narrow approach, and schools, and this has happened in Connecticut, schools who think that restorative practice is only about disciplining different fail. They absolutely fail, because the majority of true restorative practice work isn't about restoration at all. It's about building, forming, transforming the environment, the climate, so that we're building positive relationships in community. So there's only two goals: build it and repair it, or restore it. That's it. So just to give you a sense of how it should be conceived, you notice the first little picture up here is a tree falling on a house. And if there wasn't a house there and that tree fell, there would be nothing to rebuild. So we can rebuild a house, repair a roof, you know, replace a window if we have a house to begin with. So the most important goal of working restoratively is the framework and the philosophy, and building that inclusive, safe community. Another aspect of working restoratively is kind of like growth. And we were all babies once, and now we're adults. We can't choose to go back, nor would we. We're adults, we're there. And once you become restorative, this is not about just classroom or school practice. This is about how you are as a parent, a community member, and so on. This is who you are. Yes, there are strategies, but it's who you are as a human being. So this is a growth process. But the last bullet point here is really the linchpin. Think about your own families. If you have multiple children or grandchildren, or if you grew up in a family with siblings, or if you were an only child with cousins and so on, those relationships are truly frenemies. They are friends, sometimes can't get enough of one another, and then at other times they are enemies. They wish that they, they're in an all-out brawl on the living room floor. But at the end of the day, in families, although we may give them chill time, we like to say kids need chill time, calm down time. They don't need to do time. That's the exclusionary discipline. But in a family, somehow we bring people back together. Whether we do it well or we do it poorly, because we're a family. We do not suspend out of a family. So working restoratively is embracing the family model. Will there be harms, conflicts, disagreements? You bet, that's part of life. But at the end of the day, separating kids and making sure they never see one another again, which is impossible to begin with, is not the answer. The answer is to help people solve the problems, repair those relationships. So working restoratively is embracing the family model. So
Well, let's just jump in quickly, Joanne, in terms of the three areas of what it means to really begin to work restoratively. If you can accept those three concepts, then think about the number of things that we face in a day. Just yesterday, we worked with a small group, well, it was a fairly large group of brand new teachers at new teacher orientation in one of our Connecticut districts. And one of them said, and others shook their head up and down, when we were discussing some of the things that are troubling and some of the things that they worry about. There's always classroom management issues, worried about that, and always worried about that massive stakeholder group that they perceive to have not very good opinions of teachers on a regular basis, and that's the parent group. Teachers often worry about how parents feel about them as, you know, the stewards of their children. So if you can look at these three issues, building a strong house, which is inclusive and safe, includes those stakeholder groups, community members, senior citizens, law enforcement officials, teachers, parents, everyone. That we grow up to try to become restorative, then when we get there, we don't want to go back. And then finally, working from a family model. And that family model is something that that parent stakeholder group understands very well. If you listen to Joanne's example, illustrative of what happens in families when things go wrong, we don't dismantle the family. And so this is predicated on not dismantling the school structure, but working within it.
Thank you for that. So this is how we sort of, and we've grown to loathe triangles in education. I think we have too many multi-tiered systems of support. But because we're talking about the climate as being 80%, we're kind of stuck with this lovely isosceles triangle. But people are like bubbles. We just float around sharing space. And that's what the bubbles in the background represent. Because if you don't have that foundation, when those bubbles bounce into one another and move in opposite directions, or when the harm is so great they explode, there's nothing to repair. So we have to repair it. Now, there's been a lot of work begun, and we're very hopeful that Connecticut may well become the first restorative state in terms of education in the nation. We've been focusing on social and emotional growth, but we cannot betray students now and go back to schools before the pandemic. We have to focus on the lessons learned. So everything restorative emanates from understanding this fundamental hypothesis, which is translated in something that's called the social practices window. So I'm going to read this. Human beings are happiest, healthiest, more cooperative, and most likely to make positive changes in their own behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And this translates into the social practices window. And notice that there are two scales: support, love, nurturance, caring, food, shelter, clothing, could be material support and emotional support. And the vertical scale is about expectations, how we treat one another, rules, boundaries, at home, chores, those kinds of things. And when you put these things together, you get the social practices window. So I'm going to recite the fundamental hypothesis again, and you can see how this works. Human beings are happier, healthier, more cooperative, and most likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And so we want to live and practice where we have very high expectations, but we provide the requisite support. We talk about differentiation when we're talking about academics, but it's no different with behavior. So another way to think about what that restorative box looks like, it's those clear expectations, rules, and boundaries of General Patton, but it's coupled with the kindness, trust, safety, and predictability of Fred Rogers. That's what we're looking for. So People sometimes erroneously believe that if you're not punishing, then nothing's happening. Please dispel that without, if you have had no true restorative practices training, can't fill in that for you here in the short time we have. But there are oceans and worlds of restorative consequences beyond this, either you punish them or you don't do anything. So these are descriptors of restorative classrooms and schools. And as you look at these descriptors, they're destinations for all, not just for some. And they're welcoming and safe for all, not just for some, which is about equity. So we're all about filling toolboxes, and that's for adults as well as for kids, academic, social, relational, and it doesn't have any compartments. So too many people believe that, again, if we're not punishing, nothing's happening. This is a huge myth. But here's a really good connection that we hope will help frame what this work is about. When you have a child who struggles with any academic subject, could be math, could be historical problem solving or writing a 5-paragraph essay, we never give up. We don't say we've been working on this for 6 months. You don't have it now. So this is off your radar screen. We're not doing math again. You're not doing math. All we do is provide more and more and more support. And that's how we have to think about relations, relational skills, social skills, and behavior. If they didn't learn it, they need it. And they're not going to get it sitting in a corner thinking about it or being home for however long we want to send them. Academic and behavioral skill building is the same. So there is a continuum of practices when you're working restoratively. And one of the myths is that these only kick in when there's a problem. Please understand that is not the case. Every single one of these strategies is neutral. In other words, you can use it when a child's doing something well, when a group's doing something well, when you want to celebrate them. You also can use it in responsive situations. So when you're using restorative questions, and everybody, I think many people know about this, it's the process that never changes. And the consequences are determined from the answers. So that if you look at this Google set, it's like building a big sandwich. You always start with what happened. You always end with, how can we fix this? But when you're asking those questions, you're the facilitator. So you're taking out of this a whole lot of the implicit bias that comes from the individuals who are usually meting out the disciplinary consequences. And that's how we start to get to the other side and make, especially helping with correct, improve behavior to be equitable. In between, meander around, finding out who was affected, who was harmed, how did you feel, what was on their mind, all that kind of stuff. So when a process is followed, the consequences are far less likely to be explicitly or implicitly biased. The process is equitable.
And
so
it's really important to note in those first 2 slides where we've introduced the use of affective and restorative questions, that there's an emphasis on consequences. And this is one of the biggest fears of administrators. I see we have some high-level upper administration administrators on this particular breakout session, teachers at the classroom level who fear or equate the word punishment with consequences. When you're working restoratively, there are always consequences, but there's a big difference between punishments and consequences. So I'm sorry, Joanne.
No. I'm just mindful of time here. And one of the things, Pat, that you always interject, which is important, when you're working restoratively, there is accountability. People say kids get away with something. Please don't tell us that's restorative. So we thought we'd end just with a few graphics. Everybody, I think, recognizes this castle graphic. It was shoved down our throats. But here's what's important. No amount of social emotional growth is going to happen unless we're in restorative environments. This is about the environment kids are in. And we could have done it with any program, but we also, we've done it with the ruler graphic or anything else. So again, if we want to achieve, get to the other side of this potential collision, we need to create restorative environments. All right, this is not a program, it's a framework. So again, we want to mitigate learning losses. This one looks like it's a duplicate, so no worries here, but just this has got to be our theory of action. So we wanted to end before we have a few minutes for questions with a poem that was given to us. Not sure who gave it to us, not sure, we don't know the author, but I think you should take this to heart. In 20 years' time, people will not ask the children of 2020 if they caught up with their studies. They will not ask them what grades they made despite the year off. They will ask them with wonder, what was it like? They will ask them, how did you cope? How did you feel? What do you remember of those days? They will listen in awe to the tales of clapping on doorsteps for the medical workers. They will sit open-mouthed to hear of daily walks being the only life we saw and how much we missed human contact and gatherings. They will be amazed to know about empty supermarkets, online concerts, birthdays spent on a screen, and a life lived inside. They will listen and sit back with amazement and say, wow, you went through so much. So think about what you would like your children to take away from this whole year. Tell them they are not behind. Tell them they are not missing out. Tell them that they are extremely special indeed, and they will be forever made stronger by this unique time. Tell them catching up is not even a thing because they have grown so much in so many other ways. Remind them too of the fun stuff, the family jigsaws, the window rainbows, the Zoom bingo, and the feeling of safety and togetherness amidst the chaos. Let them take that thought with them through life. Change the narrative now and it will travel far. Tell the children that they are not behind, they are special. They are special. So you have the recording, we'll share these slides, but we do want to give time for comments, and I'll stop sharing in a minute, but this is how you reach us. And our website, School Climate Consultants, is quite meaty and rich with resources, as well as with all of the different services that we have around this area, short form work and longer form training sessions. But at this point, let's open it up. We have a few minutes for questions and comments.
Joanne and Pat, I do have a question related to the poem that you just read. Tell the children they're not behind, that particular line. Could you comment on that in the concept of retention to support the kids and all their needs?
Well, I'll tackle this first and Pat can jump in. I think that the language that we use, like retention, is toxic. And I think we need to take kids from where they are and move them forward. All of the grades and the levels and so on are so arbitrary. And in the beginning of this pandemic, we had much discussion around how can we reframe this? And a lot of it was anti-racist. And I think we need to revisit that. We recommend, for example, that in-school suspension rooms be renamed, reflection rooms, resource rooms, Zen dens, anything but in-school suspension. So why do we have to rub in kids' faces that they're behind? They know that. Well, it's not productive. And so I think how we frame it for kids, that's the threat piece. You're going to have to be held back. That doesn't help. It just pushes them further away. Pat, I don't know if you want to add to that, but.
Well, I do believe that the poem also speaks in large measure to what happens often when children go home. You know, when there have been issues in schools, for example, and you're trying to work with that stakeholder group of parents or community members, trying very hard not to label a child. And sometimes parents are so frantic about things without having an opportunity to work with school officials or with the teachers. You know, they greet the children at the front door and the first thing they say is, you know, who bothered you today? What's happening? Are you still having that problem? Rather than just letting the children sort of deal with what they have and come to it in their own language. So greeting them at the door and saying, you know, How was your day today? Tell me how you enjoyed. What did you enjoy? Did you do something that you enjoyed? And trying to change that narrative. There's a lot of literature right now about this awful pandemic year, almost year and a half that we've spent since schools were closed on that fateful March 13th. And the idea of this is to, try not to keep pushing the issue that, you've got so much to make up, you're way behind, your generations behind other generations coming after you and so on. But to change that narrative, to focus on what they have accomplished, what they have done.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
We just about out of time, unless there's one last quick question.
Please feel free to reach out to us. Again, school climate consultants, there's email, there's phone number, we're happy. And it's so nice to see so many friends that we've worked with and others that maybe we will be able to work with, because this is life-changing and we can't go back.
Great. All right, thank you, Joanne and Pat, for taking the time to share with us your expertise and help us dive more deeply and explore how we can solve the complex and overlapping problems of inequity, trauma, social emotional deficits, and learning losses through the eyes of third bucket kids.